Welcome, I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
This is our review for the month of February. This month, we're going to review a documentary called The Jump.
Yeah, it's basically brand new. It's come out in 2020, but it's just starting to see release around the world. We had the privilege of watching it last night. It depicts an international incident in which a man called Semis Kudirka, a Lithuanian aboard a Soviet vessel, jumped onto the deck of the USS Vigilant, an American Coast Guard ship, and tried to defect. And after a major fracas over the coming hours, the Americans ultimately resolved to hand him back, allowing Soviet officers aboard an American warship to drag him back for trial in the Soviet Union. This was an extraordinary incident that had major repercussions domestically in the United States, not to mention for Semis himself. Now, the film is an excellent documentary, and we'll go into it in detail. We'll keep it kind of non-spoilery at the start. So what I've told you right now, it happens really early on and is what the film is about, the ultimate fallout drama. Yeah. And then when we do get to the kind of in-depth analysis, the character analysis, the filmmaking, we will give a spoiler warning at that point. So if you don't want to continue at that point, you can go away, watch the film, and come back when you're ready for the deeper discussion. Sure. The film is made by a Lithuanian woman called Giedrė Žickytė. It's a co-production of Moonmakers, VSF Films, Naked Edge Films, with a global distribution and sale by MetFilm.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it would follow journalist Semis Kudirka, where there was an important meeting between the United States and the Soviet Union about fisheries. And I think Semis saw this as an opportunity to take asylum into the US. So he basically jumped.
Yeah, and there was really fascinating interviews in this documentary. So Semis Kudirka is there as himself. He's 90 years old at the time of this filming, and yet he is definitely robust. He's
so lively.
Very lively, very energetic, able to kind of communicate in a very animated way. And as we see later in the film, this is part of who he is throughout his life. There's footage of him younger, decades before, and he's equally animated and equally expressive. So for a Lithuanian, that is actually quite unique. He's extremely extroverted, I would say, in terms of the way he talks and interacts with people. He's very connected and very emotive when he talks about things. So there's a reenactment of what happens at the early stage of the film, where he's explaining what happened during his time on the USS Vigilant, where he's telling this in a he takes you right there. This is a 90-year-old man who, blow by blow, shows you what happened.
I totally agree. And it's very authentic. I kind of the way he communicates to the audience is kind of like you're kind of following it like he's your family member. And he points at things like, oh, then that happened. And then I went overboard and then they called me back and this bloody doorknob.
Yes.
All these little quirks, and it's just incredibly authentic. That's exactly how you try to, share your story for other people to understand.
Yeah, he's a very likable character. Very, you want him to succeed, and he wins you over immediately. So he's a very good protagonist in that respect, a deeply sympathetic character. And also the interviews are all very high level. So they've got survivors from the USS Vigilant, including the captain, who had to make the decision to allow the Soviets to come and take him back because it wasn't his decision. He was ordered to by a Rear Admiral Ellis. And then, of course, there is Kudirka himself, but then there is US Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger is in this film. There's an interview with him where he's talking about the way the President Ford dealt with the situation. There's also a scene where he's giving a eulogy at President Ford's funeral when he's talking specifically about this incident. So there's some great archival footage that's used. And also the KGB, who interrogated Kudirka when he was returned to the Soviet vessel, they're interviewed as well. So this is an extremely well-constructed documentary film which has all of the drama, but also the authority that comes with having those multiple perspectives and the different actors involved.
Yeah, I did like how they did weave in real life. It is documentary, but like how they weaved in the historical, what are they called? Videos from the time of reporting. So, it basically opens up with a bang with the President of the United States being interviewed. Like, what is your comment about Semis Kudirka? Very high profile people discussing this issue, and it kind of emphasizes that this was a political drama.
Very much so. And I like to think of myself as someone who is very well versed in history, particularly Cold War history. I knew next to nothing about this incident. So it's really brought back something that many people probably would have forgotten, even people who lived through that time, as just this sort of footnote. And yet it has a longer story that covers a period of years condensed into this relatively punchy documentary. It's quite short, runtime 84 minutes. And as in terms of an unfolding drama, it doesn't feel like a documentary. No. It feels like a great, intense fictional drama. It's almost hard to believe what's actually happening. And in fact, my screen crashed a couple of times while I was watching it. Really dramatic points, and Charlene's on the Discord going, "What? I want to watch the next bit."
Yeah, I know. I was like, "Bloody hell, mate!" It's just getting to the good bit. No.
Which is rare for a documentary.
True.
Particularly because normally what you have is like some kind of mystery that's announced at the start of the film, and then you're slowly going through the period of discovery where you're putting the pieces together. Yeah. Whereas this is blow by blow, action-packed adventure. And it's filmed in a documentary way and has all the main characters representing themselves. But the actual story is really explosive. And one of the great aspects of this is it was so un-American what happened. So Kudirka jumps onto the USS Vigilant, tries to defect. And if you put yourself in this position, this is 1970 America, the Cold War is absolutely raging, and they allow Soviet officers to board an American war vessel, right, which is what Coast Guard ship is, and beat a guy basically into unconsciousness and to drag him off the ship. Now, because of the time and place in which it occurred, they couldn't contact the relevant people necessary to overrule the Admiral's orders. So you couldn't get anyone from the State Department. You couldn't get anyone from the White House. And there is interviews with those players after the fact talking about what a humiliation this was for the United States. It really fed into Soviet propaganda as well. They could say, if you try and defect to the United States, look what happens. They'll hand you back.
Hand you back,
Yeah, so don't even try. And the idea...
Was there an identity crisis at that time, I guess, of what it means to be American, and it just was so contrary?
Yes, and this was a time which was quite contentious within the United States. 1970, the Vietnam War has turned into this terrible quagmire. Nixon is president. It was a very difficult time in the United States, and we'll get into that probably more in the spoiler territory. But in terms of the film as it is, the first two acts of the film, because it's kind of divided into three clearly separate parts. The first part is the drama of what happens, ultimately resulting in Semis Kudirka being returned to the Soviets and the political fallout within the United States that occurs from that. The second act is about what's happening to Semis Kudirka in the Soviet Union and the efforts in the United States politically, socially, to bring change to the United States to ensure that either Semis Kudirka can be brought out and that this won't happen again. And then the third act is kind of Semis's personal journey as how he's changed over the decades.
Yeah. Who do you recommend for someone to watch this kind of film?
First of all, anyone who is interested in good documentary filmmaking. It's extremely well constructed, and it doesn't matter what your political views are. It has its own message, but it's not super overt. And so anyone who's interested in just good film, good drama, and showing how you could tell good stories in a documentary format. Because when people think documentary, they're often thinking National Geographic, then the lion stalks the zebra, right?
No. I'm thinking of like these like interviews, and then they're like, oh, and this happened, and we're gonna call this person. It's the receptionist. They know everything.
Yeah, it's very well constructed in terms of keeping you on the edge of your seat,
Yes.
wanting to know what happens next. So that's a very so anyone who wants to be entertained, anyone who likes fictional political dramas, if you like the Tom Clancy movies, if you like those sort of thrillers, those political shows, well, this has it all. This has height of Cold War drama, but it's a real story and people are emoting from their own perspective. So it's a really fantastic film. It highlights the plight to a great degree of those living under Soviet occupation who were kind of forced to be part of the Soviet Union. Their yearning for freedom and liberty and the way they perceived America to be. I thoroughly recommend this film. It's way better than it has any right to be. I hadn't heard much about it except from our audience here at Baltic World saying, well, maybe you should check this out.
Yeah.
I was really kind of thinking that this would be sort of second tier sort of film. Obviously I hadn't heard of it, so I wasn't. It's not that at all. It is a top tier documentary. It will go down in the history books as a absolutely smashing film. And it's been a while since we've seen a documentary like it. I think in some ways the internet age, like YouTube and things, has broken the documentary model a bit, because people can, if they're interested in a subject, they just type it into YouTube and it'll come up with Wars of the Roses or whatever it is.
This is super unique because you need the players involved really to tell the story properly. Like you wouldn't be able to, because they did a recreation of what had happened like in the 1970s, but it's not the same. Not
at all. Yeah.
So
and the time frame it takes place. So the incident occurs in 1970. There is a lot that happens over the next 6 years, which is pretty much the first 2/3 of the film, and then from the late 1970s to today is the last third of the film. And I think this is probably where we will introduce spoiler warnings. I would say that the film is at least, for documentary standards, probably 8.5 out of 10, maybe 8 out of 10. It's a little bit weaker in the third act, I think, although the message is deeper. But definitely, if you get a chance, The Jump, that's the English name for it. Check it out online. It's a fantastic film. It's short, it's punchy, and it tells a really human story in the context of huge international events. You've got this guy, Semis Kudirka, who's just a small guy, and then you've got the US Secretary of State. They're all there. What do you reckon?
Yeah, no, I totally rate it as well. I'd say 8 out of 10. And there's some parts, like, even though it's a drama, there are some parts you're like, because of it, like Remus, he has such a character, right? And you kind of say, he's just, there's bits of parts you're like kind of taken out a bit. And it's just entertaining. I'll just say it's basically quite entertaining. Would recommend it. I'm not really a big fan of political documentaries. It definitely went above my expectations in some ways, just because when I was looking at just, what it was all about, what I could find, the trailer and everything, and I saw that, there's like politics involved, I was like, maybe it's going to be like something so dry and boring. But it's fast. Like you said, the first 2/3 of the film is so quick that you're on the edge of your seat thinking like, what's going to happen next? Incredibly entertaining. Would recommend for those just wanting something to binge watch, I think.
Yeah, and it's an absolutely true story. Everything that happens in it is...
It's a human story, and like there's heartwarming moments as well. But I definitely want to go into the spoiler part now.
So we'll give a spoiler warning. We will be talking in depth about all of the characters, the different elements of the filmmaking, our own criticisms of the film, things that we would have done a little bit differently, some of the broader context. But spoiler warnings from now. I don't think that it's a terrible thing if you watch the spoiler version and still go and enjoy the documentary. This does talk about a historical thing that happened. But if you think that it will ruin it for you, go watch the film and come back and watch this, because we do go into some depth.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So, like you said, it opens up with the scene, and he kind of jumps in the ocean, river, and it's like into the unknown kind of thing. It's a very tight movie in that sense, right? Because it kind of finishes off coming out of the lake at the end in the finale. So again, I really love Semis Kudirka's character, especially like I said, I feel like I was being brought on this journey with him, and describes all these little quirks. He's like, I don't know where to jump, but you know, where he basically very early in the film, he was like, when he was on the edge of the boat, like reenacting the whole thing, he was thinking whether to jump off or not into the ocean. Like, do I drown? And he's like, well, the gulag is over there and freedom is here. Like, and it was just, again, like he highlighted that point of like, at that stage, his perception of the United States was this almighty country that upholds freedom and human rights. So it was, it just feels like, oh, okay, so that's the position they're going for.
Yeah, they do a good job early on at framing his state of mind when all of this was happening. So he talks about the stories from his grandfather, about the adventures on the open sea, the tropics with palm trees. And of course, he lives in the Baltic, so he doesn't have any concept of this really. And then he dreams that if he's on a boat, he's going to see the world. But he's within the Soviet Union, he never gets that opportunity. He spends 20 years basically on this boat that doesn't really go anywhere. It's always under cloud. The weather's always bad. It doesn't see anything interesting. And he's on the crew when they are off to see an important meeting with the US about fisheries. And the crews are starting to exchange gifts. They're throwing cigarettes and hats and jackets.
And magazines.
Yes, and that's what brings it to a head, is that the Americans throw all kinds of magazines over to the Russians. And he's a Lithuanian, so he picks it up as a crew on this Soviet vessel. And he's reading through the magazines. And then the political commissar comes out and yells at them, presumably because they see it as propaganda. And that's when it's brought home to him. It's like, oh, this is my life. It's not what the Americans experience at all. So that's when he kind of resolves that no matter what, I'm getting over there and I'm going to defect.
Yeah, exactly. And it's quite amazing, right? Like the decision that he made, that's that decision to defect. And he has this moment where he sees one of the guards, or was it one of the crewmen? Crewmen. And he exchanges like just eye contact and being like, I'm going to jump, I'm going to defect. And even the guy, even though they're not speaking at all, he can't understand English, that human connection that they make instantly. And even the crewman was like, yeah, I knew that he wanted to defect at that point. And then wrote a note down and probably in poor English and being like, I'm going in a cigarette, and like threw the packet over. Like I found that quite a powerful message that, even though, you might not share the same language, like, values matter, like, and you're able to communicate that. And
when he jumps over, I think it's worth spending a bit of time putting yourself in the shoes of the crew of the Vigilant. When at this stage of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall has been up for decades, so it's separating East and West Berlin. All machine guns of the Berlin Wall are faced inwards to prevent people from escaping to West Germany. There is so much about the Soviet Union that is about preventing people from escaping and defecting to the West, and the West holding itself up as the beacon of light on the hill that everyone is yearning for, that freedom, that democracy. And that's deep down in the American psyche, that everyone really is an American and that all people really want is to be free. And to have someone jump over to your ship and say, I want to be part of you, he makes it clear that he's Lithuanian. They would know that Lithuania is an occupied country. And so this crew has suddenly rescued someone, basically, essentially. And they go and they put him away and they hide him. And it's clear that they're thinking, okay, we've got a defector and the Russians be damned. But then they phone it in and they make the point that this is the worst time of day for this to happen.
It's so this is the worst time of day. It's 4:30 in the afternoon. Everyone's going home.
Yeah.
Is government ever like this everywhere? No.
Yeah, but I mean, remember, 1970, no mobile phones, no emails, no nothing. Like, if you aren't in the office and you're in a commute or something, there's no way anyone can contact you. So they got orders from the year Admiral Ellis saying, no, we don't want to disrupt the
fisheries
discussions, and therefore, give him back. And obviously the crew didn't want to hand him over, so they allowed Russians to come on board. And the scene that's described by both Semis himself, but also the crew, the Vigilant, as to what actually happened to him to get him off the boat was...
It's horrific. Like, you kind of just see his rights being stripped away from him on a US boat, like him being chased and then being off the edge and then getting pulled down from the stairs. And then having them like, oh, okay, yeah, well, that scene when like he calls up again to see whether he's doing the right thing or not.
Yeah, and he's given potentially an out. Now, this is not something that is stressed in the film at all. Okay, it's not laboured as a point, but there is a moment where the people aren't really understanding or don't seem to be understanding what's going on. They're like, oh, is the weather too bad to hand him back? Now, that was a clear, to me, opportunity to be like, yes, the weather's terrible, right? And we should wait till the next day. It's too unsafe to trans people off the boat, right? In other words, if the crew had kind of thought outside the box, they could have delayed long enough so that the higher-ups, the people in the White House, could make the final decision. Be like, no, of course you're not handing him back. What are you, crazy? So that would have been an out. And all of the problems could have gone away if they had simply come up with an excuse as to why it was unsafe to offload him at that particular point in time. But it was a missed opportunity.
It was because they were on the boat and the boat was already moving at that point away from the Soviet ship. So they would have to get another boat. And they saw him. He was basically squashed to the ground at the bottom of the smaller boat that they pulled on. Like, oh my gosh. You think about that, right? Like, wouldn't you have an identity crisis as an American? Be like, what are we doing here? I'm sure that the crewmen, I mean, they were trying to obey orders, I guess, but... Yeah,
well, it's unbelievable. Like, I actually struggled, if I put myself in the shoes of an American sailor, like military sailor, the idea that we would hand someone who was in an occupied country trying to defect to our country back to the enemy is just absurd once they're on American soil, okay?
Yeah.
And the fact that an admiral who was ultimately retired after this incident, by the way, could think that was the right thing to do for the sake of some fisheries discussion was just, like, it was beyond the pale of stupidity. It was a very, very bad decision. Everyone recognized it was a bad decision.
Yeah.
But the film, I was thinking that going into this, that maybe the whole film was about that incident and then he gets handed back and then we never see or hear from him again. But of course we know that it's him because we see him and he's the protagonist of the film. So most of the film is after this incident occurs. So he gets handed back and then what happens to him?
Yeah, so he gets handed back, then he has to go to court, basically. And it's handed down that because he defied the Soviet Union, it's basically a political, what's that word called?
He was a traitor to the Soviet
Union.
Yeah,
he basically labeled as a traitor. So sentenced to 10 years. But it was amazing. Like, they interviewed the interrogator and he said, why did you jump? He's like, well, I think I could earn more money and buy a radio. That was it. And I was like, huh.
Exactly.
It wasn't politically motivated. It wasn't meant to send a message to the world about the Soviets and the US and which is better and which more powerful. It was like, it seems more free over there and they seem happier.
Yeah, he does seem like a bit of a peasant, Semis. Very likable, very intelligent peasant, but a peasant. Someone who's not thinking politically, he's thinking in terms of, his material well-being.
But then also, you want to defect. I guess you're in that moment of crisis, right? It was definitely reactionary because he had family in Lithuania. Like, he had a wife and kids.
Yeah, and they don't really explain this fully, which I think we'll get to a bit later. Because I think they're making Semis as sympathetic as possible, which is, and he is a very likable guy and a great protagonist. And he is seemingly, like, he is a nice guy. But I also think, like, he did try to run away from his wife and his kids.
Yeah, like, because ultimately they'll be punished. Like,
and in fact, it's even dodgier than that, because some of the magazines that they get thrown over to the Soviet vessel are like ladies' magazines, right? Gosh. So he's like picking up a picture of naked women. He's like,
no.
So there's a bit flaky there, but still a very likable character. But one thing I actually found interesting there. The KGB interrogator that they interview, he is a Lithuanian himself. He has a Lithuanian name. Clearly, he was chosen to interrogate because he could speak fluent Lithuanian. And he defends himself a bit in the interview. He's like, see this picture of Semis? He obviously doesn't look roughed up or anything. It doesn't look like I've injured him at all. Now, that's a very defensive thing to say. And they could have used any picture of Semis, really. Like they
and voiceover.
Well, like they could have used a picture of him before he went to sea, you know, whatever. Like, and it throws up something that's quite interesting about those in the occupied territories who were previously working for the Soviet regime. This guy is a Lithuanian. He was a former KGB. I would be curious about his story as well. We don't get into it, of course, and that's not about that.
Yeah.
But I'd be interested to see what his life has been like in the free Lithuania.
Right.
Does he live in Lithuania? Does he live somewhere else? These are things that I would...
Does he feel true Lithuanian, I guess?
Yeah. Now, the filmmaker, Giedrė, she is now married to the Lithuanian ambassador to Russia. So it may be that this former KGB Lithuanian is living in Russia. That would make sense. He may not be particularly welcome in Lithuania. Who knows? I found that story kind of interesting, but he did have a kind of defensiveness in his attitude. And he did have a kind of...
Do you find like a lot of people that talk about Rima's story like in pain? In some ways? I don't know. Like...
Of course.
Like... Yeah, like as they try to bring up memories, they point to photos and, you know, what had happened, and there's just this sense of sadness and like, yeah.
So many people failed him. The crew on the USS Vigilant, the people that they interview, you can see in their eyes that what they want more than anything is to go back to that day and make a different choice. You know, if they had ignored the orders, nothing bad would have happened to them, because clearly they would have done the thing that the president wanted, right? And if they had come up with an excuse, then they could kind of pretend that they didn't break orders. They're like, oh, it was unsafe. You know, we were at sea. We realized that we couldn't safely bring the ships. We're worried about damaging the Soviet ship. We could ram that accidentally, whatever it is. Just to wait until they get new orders. Because... the idea of just the whole scenario is so absurd.
It's kind of amazing like how things transfold like from this one single decision.
Yeah, and one guy from the Vigilant did say that, you know, he was already exhausted from the day's events.
True.
And had he actually just thought about it a little bit more, like, he just wouldn't have happened that way. He would never have allowed him to be taken away, regardless of what the orders were. And that was clearly the right decision. And then, of course, this KGB interrogator, he's kind of protecting himself a little bit and sort of saying that he went to his notes, he talked about the interrogation, he talked about his treatment, and then the result. And so Semis gets moved from the political prison in Vilnius, Lithuania, where he was taken for his interrogation. We'll come back to things about that, because part of the story that happens later is Semis's own experience of the other prison inmates and some of the other people he tries to help later. But that's part of his personal journey.
Yeah.
He gets moved to Siberia, or the Urals, basically. He can feel the breaths of Siberia, according to him, in this camp, where he spends the next 3 years. He feels like he's totally forgotten that everything he had was over. His wife, his children is all gone because he's been labeled a traitor to the Soviet Union. And why would anyone remember him?
Yeah.
But people do remember him.
Yeah, people do remember him. And then we had a few advocates in the US, basically. And then there cuts the footage of people protesting, like, how can this happen? And say Remus. And like, there was a moment where they got the congressman involved as well.
Yes.
And they kind of emphasize that as a point of, as a linchpin, I guess, for him to be, enabling him to be able to be released from this camp. So claiming that there were a lot of Lithuanians that lived in his district.
So they have an interview with one of the political operators who's advising this new political aspirant. And he tells him, there's a lot of Lithuanians in his district. And then, what happens?
Tells the congressman there's 40,000 Lithuanians in this district. So we're going to mention the situation with Semis Kudirka in your speech. And so he does. And then gets a standing ovation. And it's like, there's something here.
So apparently this politician knew nothing about Lithuanians or any of the issues that they were thinking about.
No, apparently not. And then he continued, was like, okay, this is a serious issue. And I think he obviously drove a bit deeper into the issue. And they kept bringing it up, being like, when are we going to release them? What are we going to do? What's the US position on it? Like, and basically become a representative for Semis in the US, which I think was a big enabler to drive momentum and media attention to the whole situation.
Yeah, and the film says that this was all a political calculus, but it comes from someone who's a political advisor. So I don't necessarily accept that. It's clear that this congressman went above and beyond what was necessary. Apparently, in every single opportunity, he would bring up Semis Kudirka. We handed him back to the Soviet Union. How are we finding out how he's being treated? How are we going to get him to the United States? So I think that he's been treated a bit unfairly, this politician. It's a bit cynical. Then there is also the public response. So the next day, President Nixon gets asked in a live press conference, the first press conference he'd actually given for some time, for months actually. And the first question is about, what about this defector that got handed back to the Soviet Union?
Yeah, and he basically said, like, it should never happen again. Like, it's very un-American.
Yeah, he's very disappointed. And then there is a lot of footage of civil society taking up the cause of Semis Kudirka as to how he got handed back to the Soviets after defecting. Lots of people.
Surprised actually just of how many people actually protested. I don't know. Maybe I'm just not used to it. Like the idea of people being so involved, like it being in mainstream media for this thing to happen. Like I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we see it with perhaps. Like an equivalent might be Julian Assange. Where he's one guy and he's got like the enormity of a superpower kind of crushing him. And in order to crush him, that superpower is bringing its own values into question. Now, people can have different views of Assange, right? And he's a much more complicated figure than Semis, right? Way more complicated. But you can see why people might protest on the sake of Julian Assange to remind America what its values are supposed to be. Openness, accountability, freedom, etc., journalism. And in the case of Semis, it's like, are you a jail keeper for the Soviet Union or are you the promised land for freedom and democracy? And so there is a clear moral distinction there. And the US government immediately, as Charlene points out with Nixon, recognized the failing, right? So then the protest was, well, what are you doing to fix it? What are you doing for Semis to bring him to the United States?
Do you think the protest was widespread because it was commented by the President of the United States?
I'm not sure. And this is something, because the footage looks like it's widespread. But it could just be, Lithuanian expat community in the United States plus some friends and allies of what was going on there. It's not clear that it was a massive movement across America. It certainly wasn't like, the Vietnam War protests or anything like that. So it might have been really important to a small number of people, but there was a broader message here, and this is kind of gets into the political environment of the time. So this happens in 1970. Vietnam has gone into a massive quagmire. It's the first television war. It's also the most visceral television war. It's no longer like now if you watch war on TV, it's all sanitized. But back then you had war correspondents filming kids running down with napalm burns, executions in the streets, all this kind of trafficking and prostitution. People were looking at this being like, what the hell are we doing? This is awful, right? And we started entire revolutionary movements. And then you had the sort of social changes, the Peel and all of this stuff where people were going through massive social transformation and upheaval. And Americans were generally speaking feeling very dejected about America. And then you fast forward to Watergate, Nixon's resignation, the failure in Vietnam. Then you had the economic kind of slowdown after the boom of the 50s and 60s. So this crisis of confidence in America between 1970 and 76, when Kudirka is ultimately released, is just this visceral time in America of total lack of self-confidence. And so this...
self-confidence in being a superpower?
Yeah, and American values. Because what you had like World War II, where America saves the world from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and is like this great beacon of democracy and hope in the world, and is facing down the evil empire of the Soviet Union. And so people had a lot of belief in America and what America was. And then that was just shattered by the Vietnam War, by the economic upheavals. Then you had a significant rise in social problems like drug use and poverty. And so people were looking at this being like, what's so great about America? America's terrible. And the sort of the anti-American sentiment within America really began to take hold. A lot of sympathy with Marxism and stuff began to increase. And the idea that America always stands up for its values, when you had this figure, Semis Kudirka, who was a great counterexample of that. Well, what do you mean we stand up for your values? If someone tries to join America, you throw them back to the Soviet Union. Yeah. So it was a great opportunity to revitalize belief in America and be like, we're going to get Semis Kudirka out of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the stars just aligned, right? So you had a few advocates working in the US and like back and forth Lithuania. And I mean, I didn't really understand the conversation, but essentially that they knew people, they knew similar people. And be like, so I knew Semis Kudirka's mother. And I was like, oh, the mother. It's like, yeah. And I was like, oh, and they talked about how, she was born in the US. That's why, like, what? What do you mean? It's like, well, there's paperwork. I have to find the priest when she came over to Lithuania. And then like the following day or next couple of days, it's like, you wouldn't believe it. I've got the priest and I've got the paperwork.
Absolutely. So what happens is the congressman is telling everybody that will listen, look, we got to get Semis Kudirka out. And they're all supportive. They're all like, yeah, but there's no way. I mean, and the Soviet Union was very blunt about it. They're like, the issue's over. The case is closed. Go away.
This is our person.
But there was a devoted group of Lithuanian expats who maintained contact with people in Lithuania, somehow managed to get around the Great Iron Curtain to discuss things and exchange notes with people in Lithuania. And as Charlene's laid out, there was evidence that Semis's mother was actually born in the United States and then later went to Lithuania. And they're saying, well, that means that Semis could be a US citizen. And there is issues around, his paternity. It's not clear who the father was. He was born out of wedlock. So going just by the mother, they're like, well, that means that...
He's American.
He's American, yeah. And that was an interesting twist. I'm not personally sure what impact... I mean, it certainly would have elevated it in the press, I think. Be like, you've thrown an American citizen to the Soviet Union. Yeah. Perhaps that was created a bit of momentum. But it was a very unusual quirk. But ultimately, that's not what gets him out of prison. So
Semis Kudirka actually gets released because of what happens in the US presidency.
Mm-hmm.
So Nixon resigns because of the Watergate controversy.
Yep.
And then you have President Ford that comes up and gets sworn to office. And his first phone call with Premier Brezhnev, is he wants to release Semis Kudirka.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And
that's how he gets out.
Yeah, and as Nixon says in both the interview with the filmmaker, but also at Ford's funeral, because he's one of the speakers and he tells this story, it was against the advice of his advisors, President Ford's advisors, because they're like, look, you don't want to get indebted to the Soviets. And Ford is an innocent. He had no experience in international affairs, really. And he just thought, this seems like a good thing to do. This Semis Kudirka, we handed him back. This wasn't the right thing to do. I'm going to ask Brezhnev to pardon him. And they do. And then there's this scene where it goes to Semis Kudirka, where the soldiers come in and be like, pack your things, you're free.
Yeah,
and he's just spent 3 years in a gulag. And it's just like, you're going to America. I mean, imagine being told that, and he's not exactly, he's a little bit suspicious.
Yeah, no, he's like, you're lying. He's like, kill me now. Like, he just doesn't, it's kind of amazing. I love the use of settings in this whole film. Like the boat scene, like basically in the beginning of how he walks through what had happened on the ship. And then, when he walks it, talks about the cab and he goes in the cell and like, points at the walls and everything like that. It's really well done. But yeah, he's like, you sure? I think you got the wrong person. People forgot about me.
Absolutely. Like he thinks that it's all over. He's just waiting to die in this camp in the breadth of Siberia. And yet he would have no idea at all that he had reached kind of celebrity status in America. And that there was a massive movement to have him released. It would have just been so alien to even imagine that. And so, he's walking out of there and is being shipped to the United States. He reunites with his family. His whole family get to go. So his mother, his wife, his children, and they all end up in the United States. And that's kind of the first 2/3 of the film, I would say. And that blow-by-blow drama of who's doing what and the various political forces. And, there's this one little guy, but then in the breadth of all of the political atmosphere of, high-level international politics, it's an extremely strong, tight, powerful filmmaking. It's a real blow-by-blow event, and that you could easily be any kind of blockbuster. If you're watching this as a fictitious thing, it would still be just as engaging. The fact that it's the real people involved in a documentary is all the best. Now, the last third, it changes gears, I think, quite dramatically, and I think that this would be the weakest part of the film. The last third, and we'll get into criticism later, but while I think the underlying message is really fine, I think there wasn't enough time to explore it, and it's not overt enough. I am all for subtlety, but you don't really get to the underlying reason. So the last third of the film is Semis's experience in the United States and how over the course of the next few decades, he goes from this young man, idealistic, looking at the world just through absolute awe in terms of what the United States is, to something much more tempered and more, I wouldn't go so far as to say cynical, but somewhat disillusioned about the United States.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the last third of the movie was a bit, I guess it's weird because I guess they're capturing footage when he was early on age and then they're trying to blend it in with his present views. So like it kind of jumped a bit more than the others, which were a bit more consistent, because it was basically just telling the story as it happened. And even when he comes to America and he's greeted by everybody, the media, the press, and he's like confused. He's like, what? I love, again, the subtleties, right? Like I love that how, he's speaking with the correspondent of Lithuanian and was like, do I bring my bedding? He's like, no, it's okay. Like, we got everything prepared. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But messaging, right? So I remember when we were watching it and you were telling me like how weird it is to be a celebrity but then be an ordinary person at the same time.
Yes, and this is actually an experience that many people have. Also, I think the filmmaker in one of her interviews talked about this. She's now more genuine celebrity now, but she went through a period where she had no money, no like thing. But when she went to film awards, she'd get in the limo and wear the cocktail dress and be like this, get on stage and do the waving and whatnot. There is a branch of people out there that are celebrities and have celebrity status, but don't really make their living from what makes them a celebrity. So if you're a famous tennis star or movie star, then you're getting a lot of money for your movies and you're getting a lot of money and a lot of fame for being a movie star. Same with your tennis and sporting heroes and stuff. But then there are people, and also politicians. If you're a president, well, you're famous for being president, but you're also paid a decent amount for being president, right?
Yeah.
But then there is a group of people that are famous in the world, but their actual livelihoods, their way of making a living is completely different to that. And they're much more living normal, anonymous lives in terms of their day-to-day.
Right.
And that the celebrity world is kind of this thing that they're looking out onto, but then being a part of and looking out as well. And it's you get the both perspectives. And it's a really weird space to be in.
And like how you said before, like you'll say you're in that scene when he's in New York, no one recognizes him. He looks like just an ordinary old man from wherever, right? But in the context of, if they had like a big shebang about Lithuania and expats and all that kind of thing, he would be like, oh my gosh, it's him. It's Semis Kudirka. It's within the context of, I guess, a very fixed context, I'd say.
Exactly. So he's talking about the jobs that he's doing in Lithuania. So good in America. So he's a Lithuanian. He's given an apartment to live in, but he's working odd jobs. He's cleaning bathrooms. He's painting walls. He's doing all these sort of dirty jobs that a lot of people don't want to do. And then he's also giving major speeches to Congress people and universities. And so there is this world in which he's famous and huge. And then there is his everyday life, which is extremely humble. And he's like, I didn't care about that. It was like the living standard differences are colossal. And I think that's true. There's a whole subset of people out there that I think are in that category. I think some YouTubers as well, like, people that are way bigger than us on YouTube, they will be famous within their YouTube groups, but then in their everyday life, no one would know that they do YouTube at all. Like if their primary audience is on the other side of the world or they're focusing on a particular subject, well, then in their normal life, no one's going to recognize them. And so there's that anonymity. And yet when they are actively doing things for that channel, they might be in a packed lecture theatre or something like that. There's examples of that.
I agree. And you can kind of see that ordinariness when he does the interview in his home and like they just like point at things and he basically says like about how living standards are so different in America compared to Lithuania, and he points to the TV and that would be like a year's worth of working to get that TV. And but like Americans see this is garbage, that is garbage. Like I picked this up from the street.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's when we start to see the early transition of his mentality. So when he first arrived in the United States, they have an interview with what he did that day. And he's like, he went to American shops and there was just this sea of goods. Like it just went on forever. And it's like, it was so beautiful. And so he's just got this very humble, starry-eyed perspective. And then a little later on, he's interviewed by the press in his home. And that point you make about like, it would be a year for me to earn that TV, which I just picked up from nothing, from something that someone threw out. And they're like, oh, you think Americans are too wasteful. And he says, well, Americans are so rich that they can't appreciate like what it is to want, and he couldn't understand why sort of people need drugs in America. And remember, this is a time where it was a big problem.
Yeah.
He says, like, in Lithuania, in Russia, definitely alcohol everywhere to deal with the harsh conditions, the difficult life. Alcohol is necessary to sustain people.
Yeah.
But not in America. In America, I can listen to the radio and just get
beautiful
overwhelmed.
music.
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, no, it is. And I guess, does he have a prove a point that, like, if you live in a world of abundance, I guess you're so far removed to understand what it is to be an occupied country and have nothing. Like,
I know many people with a Soviet mentality, because that is a Soviet mentality where the idea of wasting money, of wasting products, not using everything possible, is just considered like a moral crime, and many people sort of my age can remember when they were little kids and their parents would be like, eat everything on your plate because worry about those kids in Africa and things like that. And if you're a smart little kid, you'd be like, yeah, send it to them. But that kind of view that things are precious and that just because you have everything today doesn't mean you'll have everything tomorrow. And also when you're living in a world with great uncertainty about your circumstances, the urge to preserve things is very great. And we see that with Chinese expats in Australia, people who came over after Tiananmen Square, after the Cultural Revolution, where China was dirt poor communist society, and they look at everything in Australia and be like, oh, what waste, like what people are throwing away, just unbelievable, things that are perfectly good. And yet that kind of form of consumerism is something that fuels capitalism and continues to grow the economy and continues to fuel growth. So we have a different set of values in the West about the form of consumption, but it is also true on the flip side that most of us don't understand what true deprivation is, and therefore can't appreciate things that we really do take for granted. I mean, the fact that we're sitting here now broadcasting to the entire world using really high grade equipment with our great like mixers and microphones and cameras, this would be, by Soviet standards, something that would be reserved for the space program. Like it'd just be, it would like, like this would be the sort of thing that they send, for tracking Yuri Gagarin as he goes into outer space. Like it's so far beyond the pale, and yet we do this almost with frustration. The card is full, I don't want to focus, Crispin. But I think they fail slightly in the film with this message.
Why?
Because they don't really explore what the outcome should be. They kind of allude to there's something missing in American society. And the climax of that is the juxtaposition of the story that Semis tells at the beginning of the film and then towards the end of the film. He's telling about the beautiful palm trees that exist in the tropics that his grandfather used to tell him when they went in the open sea. And then he says, when he's thinking about sort of leaving America and moving to Lithuania, he says, once you get close to the palm trees, you have to look after them, you have to prune them, and they're kind of prickly, right? He's starting to see things about the United States that are unfulfilling, the consumerism, the materialism, the sense you might not have what you need in the Soviet Union to get by, but you do have community, you do have family, you do have connection to your history and tradition. Whereas
you have that in the context, if you know that, right? It wasn't portrayed that properly. Like that's probably one of my criticisms was they touched on it in terms of I found it quite jarring actually. So, he, again, starry-eyed wanted to be in the US, right? And defect, but then suddenly wants to be part of Lithuania, but we didn't get any background of what his life was like in Lithuania. There was no contrast. There was no even him living in the US and how he experiences the US as Lithuanian, being part of the Lithuanian community and the expat community, connected with them. There wasn't enough of that for me to understand why he wanted to leave, in the first place.
Exactly. And the social commentary is not quite compelling enough for me in that respect. The message is really interesting, but I think it needed more time and more explanation. Remember, there really wasn't. This is all done in like the last 20-25 minutes of the film.
Yeah.
So it was a real bait and switch because you've got this massive political drama with all the hard-hitting interviews and unfolding issues, and you're sitting on the edge of your seat, and then it really slows down. The other thing about this that I think made it a little weaker was he has all these letters from when he first arrived, people telling them, you're such an inspiration, blah, blah, blah. And then they've got scenes of him as an old man going to speak to these people that were little kids and stuff that are now all grown up. And it's such an obvious setup from a filmmaking perspective. It's that kind of thing where you're like, oh, can you just walk and see each other on the street and start talking? And then we'll film it. I mean, that's perfectly understandable from a documentary kind of perspective. You see that on the evening kind of current affairs shows and things like that as well. But there is an artifice to it that looks there's a bit too obvious. When you've got the hard-hitting interviews and it's jumping from, KGB officer over here to Semis to Kissinger and that is epic. And then you can just see the beautiful construction of documentary interview. But when you've got okay, what we're going to do is we're going to get all these people that admired you. We're going to get you to go see them and then we'll film it. That was a bit... I personally, some people might love it, but I personally didn't see that adding value since you had the opportunity to focus on his transition from being starry-eyed immigrant to disillusioned wanting to go to Lithuania. And I also thought that the absence of his family in the documentary was kind of telling. So his children still live in the United States. Now, nothing... That alone doesn't mean anything. He could go to Lithuania. His kids might have grown up and had families and they're all Americans and therefore it doesn't make sense for them to kind of go to Lithuania. So that doesn't mean to say that they're estranged or anything like that. But the fact that the children aren't interviewed at all, what was it like having just come from the Soviet Union, not speaking English, being dumped in America, in this whole new world.
Suddenly getting all this media attention that you also don't understand.
Exactly. I would have loved to have got that perspective rather than these random people who had written letters, from high school and primary school.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it was filmed later. But no, I agree. It would have been good to have more family background to understand what it was like. And then again you kind of get, and it's interesting as well, being an immigrant, right, being a Lithuanian and then basically but growing up in America, what is that kind of experience do you feel more American or do you feel more Lithuanian, what's the similarities, what's the differences?
And they do have a shot of Semis in Times Square in New York, just overwhelmed by the consumerism and the people everywhere. And he says, it's beautiful, but it's not for me. And then there is there was a film made about Semis in 1978, a kind of an American drama. And he's watching it and he gets really emotional watching the film, of course, as you would about a film about your own story. But he does make mention it's very Americanized, i.e. it wasn't like his wife was there kind of, oh, you're free, you're going to America. It wasn't, there was clearly a disparity between that dramatization and what really happened. Yeah. And they don't explain what really happened. What is it specifically about being Lithuanian that makes it hard to connect with the American dream? Because in some ways Lithuanians are among the most freedom-loving, democracy, rule of law, ardent evangelists in the world. They're picking a fight with China, for God's sake, over this kind of stuff. So they've really taken up the mantle of American kind of ideals, and yet they're not Americans. They're Lithuanians, and they have a different thing. But the filmmaker, who's also Lithuanian, shows this to be the case, but they don't really explain what that difference is. You get a sense it's about consumerism and gratitude and connection, but they don't spell out why. And I think that was just sort of an incomplete message that sort of left hanging there. I would like to know more exactly. And if you cut out some of the interviews with people who wrote letters and focused more on Semis's psychological journey, then you could have probably squeezed that message in if that's the message you wanted to tell.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think like that scene where he does have those interviews with people who wrote letters in as an extra, and then have a bit more time at the end with him living in Lithuania. Because we get a lot of scenes of him in America, but not much in Lithuania. Even though we're back at his house at the end in the last scene, and it would be nice to, and again it's only in his home. It would be nice for him to be part of the community and like do his everyday things and show like what he actually genuinely values. Like that would have been enough, I think.
One thing that the filmmaker does do, and Charlene made this point immediately after we watched it. She said that. The problem with this film, Crispin, is that, it's a fantastic film, but what's the message of the documentary? What are we supposed to do now? What are we supposed to believe? What's the filmmaker trying to tell us? And the one thing I could sort of half take away from it is the idea that in America, values are often driven by celebrity, right? And the celebrity message is quite important. So Semis Kudirka realizes that he just hit the jackpot, that this was a dream, that this is something that could just never really happen in reality, and yet it has. And so he wants to help people who are political prisoners, people are suffering in the gulags. And if we go back to the scene where he's in that political prison in Vilnius, and there's this other guy that he clearly knows. He sees a picture of him on the wall because it's now like a museum. And he sees a picture of him that a guy he knew, and he's like crying. He's like, Paul Vaitutis, like this guy that he obviously knew and cared about. And then the people in the gulags, and he said, look, I lobbied, all the politicians, everybody to try. And he said, I couldn't save one person. And so he's looking at this as like, I was saved not because people really care about me and my suffering, but because I was famous in America and that there was a constituency and that people could see it as politically expedient. And I think that was like, that's a message you could bring, and that added to his personal disillusionment. I think that the filmmaker tried to make that point as well, that American values aren't necessarily consistent. They're deeply relative to where people's attention is. And that's certainly true for most countries that are media driven. Australia's the same. We'll care a lot more about people we can see on the television than people we can't see.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And you can see the example of this situation happening all the time, right? Like people who are somehow this poor family in detention centres suddenly say Australia, for instance, comes to Australia, and people are advocating, but like they should stay in Australia. But like he's like, yeah, they could. Yes, we could do that, and use political levers to do that. But there's still other families, and they never get the media spotlight. Like
That's true.
It's a cycle.
That's true. And it's the thing about Semis's case in particular, although America had a special responsibility because he actually applied for asylum on American soil.
Yeah. And he was American.
Yeah. Yes. There's a clear-cut right and wrong. You had people in occupied territories who just want their independence and freedom and are locked up as political prisoners, and America stands against that. So on that level, Semis should have been able to get more support in America than he actually did. Yeah. Whereas, like, there are other cases, asylum seekers, etc., where people have different political views and it's a contentious issue. Yeah. Well, this is clearly black and white. So it's something that the ordinary American, whatever your political persuasion, whether you're like pro-immigration in America or anti-immigration, whether you're conservative or progressive, everyone would basically agree that letting people rot in gulags in the Soviet system was a bad thing, and that America stood for freedom and justice, and the fact that Semis was sent back to the Soviet Union was a disaster. So that kind of unifying message was, I think, makes that documentary able to reach everybody.
Yeah. But do you think, because how he tries to get other people out of the gulag and failed, do you think that's just because the situation had changed, or I guess the agenda just moved on?
Well, that's the kind of message that is sort of being conveyed, that it's easier to tell an individual story Semis, this drama on the seas, etc., get people caring about him as an individual. Like as Stalin says, the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. It's harder for people to conceive the Gulag system and political prisoners and all of that as a abstract concept, much less prioritize it in their day-to-day lives. And we see this all the time. There's this guy who is a co-owner, I think, of the NBA in a television show, just came out and said, I don't really care about the Uyghur issue. It doesn't rate on my rate. Now, he was universally attacked. But it was an honest answer. It was a terrible thing to say and a terrible thing to think. But it was an honest answer. He was saying the honest truth, which is he just doesn't think about this as a major issue in his life. And there is a lack of empathy there, but also a truth there that we don't generally, as people, think about things that are happening very far away in places we can't do anything about when we've got issues much closer to home, unless it's brought to us in a specific way. So although the film kind of sends the message that there is this sort of facade in America, that things aren't quite sincere, that it's kind of celebrity driven, and there's all these there's all these things on the poster that when you drill into it, when you get closer to the palm tree, they're not real. They're a bit of a mirage. I think, just judging it as myself, I think there's an element of truth to that, but I don't think it's unique to America. And I don't think it takes away from the American ideal and their values, right? Like if America was a different type of country, they wouldn't have cared about Semis at all. And so, yes, the fact that things happened in the way it did and got all the attention it did, that was a decisive factor in that man's fate. Just because of that doesn't take away necessarily, in my view, that America actually does have these ideals and people do believe this stuff. So, yeah.
I can't believe any country is perfect anyway. Like, there's always imperfections, right? When you're such a big superpower, everyone looks to you. There's just so many things happening. So it's America is idealistic, but broken in some areas.
Well, that's the thing. When people say Americans are hypocritical, I don't think that's true. Americans are one of the few countries that puts their ideas out there and say they're universal. These are our beliefs, and we believe everyone are better off this way. And they themselves fall short of these ideals. That's what makes them ideals in some ways. Americans are sinners, okay? But they still have those ideals. It's not like, this is what we believe, but we don't actually want to do it ourselves. When they say things, they genuinely believe it. And just because they fall short, it means that they're imperfect. It doesn't mean that they're hypocrites necessarily. And what I would have liked to have seen in the documentary is, what is Lithuanian values? Like, if they're not the same as American values, where do they differ? And they're alluded to, but they're not actually stated. So there's also the issue of immigrants, which I think the filmmaker kind of introduces. So we don't actually hear the question, but Kissinger says, I'm very sympathetic to immigrants. I myself was an immigrant, but this is a special case, right? There would have been a question that prompted that answer about immigrants, I would say, people coming to the United States. Then there is an interview with a young girl in primary school that is now a woman, and she's like, oh, yes, I'm dedicated to immigrants now and immigrant rights. But I think when I was a child, the story of Semis really kicked that off. So I think the filmmaker is trying to convey a message about immigration in the United States, which would be more politically contentious, but it's done very light on, and it's never made explicit. So it's not clear to me that is an agenda for the filmmaker.
It's a difficult agenda because Semis went back. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's contradictory. If you want to be like, we're going to welcome immigrants in, pro-immigration, and yet he went back. So that's probably why it wasn't followed through as much. It wasn't as strong.
That's a very good point. That is a very good point, because it's never made clear why he goes back. They've got that juxtaposition of him in Times Square, and then going, it's beautiful, but not for me. Was it just because it was hectic? or was there some underlying disillusionment?
So as like an inner city person, it's just like, I see no difference. I see a farm and I see the city. Like, whereas like,
Exactly. But these things are really interesting themes that I think they just needed to pick one. Was it disillusionment? Was it immigration? Was it the United States and celebrity? And just focus on that on the third part of the film, and then they might have been able to tell a full story. So, for example, if you're focusing on the celebrity aspect, then you take away all those letters that were written to Semis as a kid, and you focus on that. Is it Semis's personal journey? Well, let's get into that. Let's talk to his family. Let's talk to how he changed over the years. So that would so that the first third of the final third of the film was just a bit more confusing. Still well made, still entertaining, but the first two thirds of the film are very hard to criticize. It's almost the perfect documentary.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the third part of the film, there was a lot of loose strings that just need to be tied off a bit more. The first two was incredibly captivating, and again, I love just the storytelling and the weaving of like using obviously it's real life events, but using all real life footage of how things were reported back then. And like you really feel immersed, even though like it's not happening right in front of you. The way he just acts out, and you're like, oh, I can see it happening right now. and then the music in the background, you're like, yes, oh my gosh. Like,
absolutely. So we will reach out to Giedrė, the filmmaker, and see if she can answer some of our questions for us, because I would like to know. I would like to know, a bit more about Semis the man. I would like to know about his family. I would like to know about Lithuanian values as from the perspective of Giedrė, the filmmaker. Was she trying to talk about, immigration in the United States? Was she not? Was that just something that other people were raising in the context of normal interviewing, and it just happened to make it into the film? Yeah. I'd be curious as to see what she was trying to go with that.
Yeah. We didn't touch on it in this episode, but like I would have liked to just have some more storytelling in terms of trauma. So, I mean, it's just a traumatic experience. I probably, may not feel comfortable sharing it. But there were moments in there that he, Semis had to pause as he was trying to tell the story. You could tell that he got very upset in that moment. It would have definitely added more value had I kind of understood, who was the person who was your cellmate, for instance. Like, you pointing to that picture, who was that person? He's like, oh, he was my best friend, or like we always used to, sneak in letters or whatever, which are like basically just that, just have some sort of connection to his experiences as he was in prison for 3 years. Because we got a lot of footage again outside, people advocating, but we didn't get his story of what actually happened.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And particularly so given his personality, because he seems very unlike the typical Eastern European, the typical Baltic person. He's not reserved, quiet. Like, he is animated and emotional and expressive and jumping around. And for a 90-year-old, literally jumping around. There's this photo shoot where he's told to jump up in the air, and he keeps doing it. He's a very animated, emotive character that is larger than life. He's got huge charisma. And when he's silent, it's
incredibly silent. And there's obviously an opportunity for showing vulnerability, and I would have liked that to be explored a bit more. Just from the perspective of people who don't know much about Soviet occupation. I think there was a opportunity explore more and be more educated.
Now, by the way, we're saying all these kind of criticisms that you might think that we from this that we don't think it's a fantastic documentary, and something we really recommend watching. And one of the reasons we have all these burning questions is because we want to know the answers.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Because they really set these things up. You're like, oh, okay. And then I felt invested in Semis. I felt invested even in the KGB, and I was invested in all the different actors. How did the captain of the ship, the Vigilant, who clearly regretted that day for the rest of his life, how has he come to terms with that? How is he, when he looks in the mirror, how has he managed to resolve this crisis of identity that he clearly has had to live with for decades. Because they have the interviews, as I say, the first two parts of the film, they have the interviews with the crew. They don't go back to them at the end. I would have liked to have been like, what have you learned? How have you changed?
Yeah.
Like those types of things. So there's just these threads that have tied up, but that's because it was gripping. It's not. So when we say we're critical, it's not that we're critical of.
No, what we want is a sequel.
Yes.
So our answers are answered. Like questions are answered.
Yes, yes. We became emotionally and psychologically invested in the different actors in this film, and that's a testament to the extraordinary storytelling and filmmaking of the makers there. So I think that's a pretty full review. Any final thoughts on the film?
Not that much of what I said already. I'm trying to think if there's any final thoughts. Go watch it if you haven't already. Watch it. Final thoughts is that it's definitely a very human take on an extraordinarily international political incident. It's definitely something that's, like we keep saying, it's gripping. Can't not watch it. Highly recommend. And if you've watched it already, leave your thoughts. Like, what do you think? Do you have answers to our questions?
Just leave spoiler warnings if you spoil, because there will be people who only watch the first bit of this film of our review. So if you do leave a comment down below, just put in spoilers if you've seen it and you want to talk spoiler talk. Yeah,
exactly. Because I'd like to hear other people's thoughts. Like, how did you find the film? Like, do you think the portrayal was accurate? Were the things that were our points valid, or do you think that actually no, the way it was carried out was perfect? I don't know.
Yeah, well, we read a review just online where they said the last third was the strongest and the best.
Yeah.
And we have a different view, of course. But so yeah, what's your perspective and take on this?
Have you got final thoughts?
No, I just mirror you. I think it's definitely go and watch it. It will be a streaming service. I can't remember which one has picked it up, so it should be available to general audiences from March of 2022.
Yeah.
We're filming this in February, so hopefully this will be up beforehand. And we will talk in the week in review if we manage to get in touch with the filmmaker about this. Maybe she will have an opportunity to watch this. I don't know. If she does, then we will let you know what her thoughts are. She might think we're the worst reviewers in the world and go stick to our day jobs. But hopefully not. And definitely go watch it. It
won an award for a reason.
It's won many awards, and it's not just parochial. You don't have to be Lithuanian or from the Baltic region to appreciate it. It does cover this extraordinary international incident. And it's affected everybody involved over the course of decades, and that really comes through. So definitely go check it out. And as I said, the thing 8.5 out of 10. If we judge it as a documentary film, it's a very strong documentary.
Yeah, no, I agree. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Any questions, feedback, like I said, hit them down below. If you have any other suggestions for this series, let us know what we should review for March. Otherwise, stay safe.
And ciao for now.